Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all doing well tonight. This evening, we're going to be reading through chapter 45 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. We're not just reading the words. We stop and we talk about interesting vocabulary words or phrases that if you're learning English, maybe you wouldn't understand so well. So we pause and we talk about these words as they happen in the context. And this is live, so if you're watching this live with me, then I encourage you to ask questions in the comments. So if there's a word that you don't understand or a phrase that isn't clear, then this is a great opportunity for you to make a question about it. If you don't ask questions, then I'll just stop sometimes when I think there's a useful word or a word that you probably don't know, or sometimes a word I don't know, or a phrase or something like that. All right, well, let's get started with chapter 45. Mr. Dick fulfills my aunt's predictions. It was some time now since I had left the doctor. Living in his neighborhood, I saw him frequently, and we all went to his house on 2 or 3 occasions to dinner or tea. The old soldier was in permanent quarters under the doctor's roof. She was exactly the same as ever, and the same immortal butterflies hovered over her cap. That's the old soldier as his mother-in-law. And she wears these hats with butterflies and things, and when she moves her head, they move too, as if they were still alive. Like some other mothers whom I have known in the course of my life, Mrs. Markleham was far more fond of pleasure than her daughter was. She required a great deal of amusement, and like a deep old soldier, pretended, in consulting her own inclinations, to be devoting herself to her child. The doctor's desire that Annie should be entertained was therefore particularly acceptable to this excellent parent who expressed unqualified approval of his direction. So the doctor is always trying to spoil his wife, and the mother-in-law loves that because she loves to be spoiled. Probably more than the daughter. I have no doubt, indeed, that she probed the doctor's wound without knowing it. To probe something is to stick something into something else. So this is probing. And a wound is something like when you're hurt. So if you didn't see the previous chapters, there's kind of a villain named Uriah Heep, and he informed the doctor that his wife was cheating on him, which was he's a very nice old man, the doctor, and that was a horrible thing to do. And so maybe now the mother-in-law is there, and she's probably saying and doing things that's, she doesn't know that he knows this now. She's probably saying and doing things that's probing the wound, sticking something into the wound. I have no doubt, indeed, that she probed the doctor's wound without knowing it, meaning nothing but a certain matured frivolity and selfishness, not always inseparable from full-blown years. I think she confirmed him in his fear that he was a constraint upon his young wife, and there was no congeniality of feeling between them, by so strongly commending his design of lightening the load of her life. "My dear soul," she said to him one day when I was present, "you know there's no doubt it would be a little poky for Annie to be always shut up in here?" The doctor nodded his benevolent head. "When she comes to her mother's age," said Mrs. Markleham with a flourish of her fan, "then it'll be another thing. You might put me into a jail with genteel society and a rubber, and I should never care to come out. But I'm not Annie, you know, and Annie is not her mother. So the mother is saying, Annie's so young she should be going out and having fun, not just staying here in the house." like an old lady. I would be fine with that, but not Annie. She's too young. Surely, surely, said the doctor. You are the best of creatures. No, I beg your pardon, for the doctor made a gesture of deprecation. I must say before your face, as I always say behind your back, you are the best of creatures. You are, but of course you don't, now do you? Enter into the same pursuits and fancies as Annie. So she's saying, you don't have the same interests as her because you're old and she's young. No, of course not, retorted the old soldier. Take your dictionary, for example. What a useful work a dictionary is. What a necessary work. The meanings of words. Without Dr. Johnson or somebody of that sort, we might have been at this present moment calling an Italian iron a bedstead. But we can't expect a dictionary, especially when it's making, to interest Annie, can we? The doctor shook his head. And that's why I so much approve, said Mrs. Markleham, tapping him on the shoulder with her shut-up fan. Of course, your thoughtfulness. It shows that you don't expect, as many elderly people do expect, old heads on young shoulders. You have studied Annie's character, and you understand it. And that's what I find so charming. Even the calm and patient face of Dr. Strong expressed some little sense of pain. I thought under the infliction of these compliments. Therefore, my dear doctor, said the old soldier, giving him several affectionate taps, you may command me at all times and seasons. Now, do understand that I am entirely at your service. I am ready to go with Annie to operas, concerts, exhibitions, all kinds of places, and you shall never find that I am tired. Duty, my dear doctor, before every consideration in the universe. So she's a very devoted mother. Don't worry, I'll spend time with Annie. I'll take her to the opera and to concerts and parties, and we'll have and I won't get tired. I'll just do it because I'm such a good mother. She was as good as her word. She was one of those people who can bear a great deal of pleasure, and she never flinched. Flinching is like if you think something is coming towards you or something is going to hit you, you go like this. That's flinching. She never flinched in her perseverance in the cause. She seldom got hold of the newspaper, which she settled herself down in the softest chair in the house to read through an eyeglass every day for 2 hours. But she found out something that she was certain Annie would like to see. It was in vain for Annie to protest that she was weary of such things. Tired. Weary means tired. Her mother's remonstrance always was, "Now, my dear Annie, I'm sure you know better, and I must tell you, my love, that you're not making a proper return for the kindness of Dr. Strong." This was usually said in the doctor's presence, and appeared to me to constitute Annie's principal inducement for withdrawing her objections when she made any. But in general, she resigned herself to her mother, and went where the old soldier would. It rarely happened now that Mr. Walden accompanied them. Sometimes my aunt and Dora were invited to do so, and accepted the invitation. Sometimes Dora was only asked. Dora only was asked. The time had been when I should have been uneasy in her going, but reflection on what had passed that former night at the doctor's study had made a change in my mistrust, and I believed that the doctor was right, and I had no worse suspicions. My aunt rubbed her nose sometimes when she happened to be alone with me, and said she couldn't make it out. To say that she can't make it out means that she can't understand it. She wished they were happier. She didn't think our military friend, so she always called the old soldier, mended the matter at all. Mending means fixing, especially fixing clothes. This is mending clothes, like sewing. But you can use mending to talk about relationships. My aunt further expressed her opinion that if our military friend would cut off those butterflies and give them to the chimney sweepers for May Day, it would look like the beginning of something sensible on her part. But her abiding reliance on Mr. Dick, that man had evidently an idea in his head, she said, that if he could only once pen it up into a corner, which was his great difficulty, he would distinguish himself in some extraordinary manner. Unconscious of this prediction, Mr. Dick continued to occupy precisely the same ground in reference to the doctor and Mrs. Strong. He seemed neither to advance nor to recede. He appeared to have settled into his general foundation like a building, and I must confess that my faith in his ever-moving was not much greater than if it had been a building. But one night, when I had been married some months, Mr. Dick put his head into the parlor where I was writing alone. Dora had gone out with my aunt to take tea with the two little birds, and said with a significant cough, "You could speak to me without inconveniencing yourself, Trotwood, I'm afraid. You couldn't speak to me without inconveniencing yourself, Trotwood, I'm afraid." "Oh, certainly, Mr. Dick," said I. "Come in." "Trotwood," said Mr. Dick, laying his finger on the side of his nose, after he had shaken hands with me, "before I sit down, I wish to make an observation. You know your aunt." "A little," I replied. "She's the most wonderful woman in the world, sir." After the delivery of this communication, which he shot out of himself as if he were loaded with it, Mr. Dick sat down with greater gravity than usual and looked at me. "Now, boy," said Mr. Dick, "I'm going to put a question to you." "As many as you please," said I. "What do you consider me, sir?" asked Mr. Dick, folding his arms. "A dear old friend," said I. "Thank you, Trotwood," returned Mr. Dick, laughing and reaching across in high glee to shake hands with me. "But I mean, boy," resuming his gravity, "what do you consider me in this respect?" touching his forehead. I was puzzled how to answer, but he helped me with a word. "Weak?" said Mr. Dick. "Well," I replied dubiously, "rather so." "Exactly," cried Mr. Dick, who seemed quite enchanted by my reply. "That is, Trotwood, when they took some of the trouble out of you know whose head, and put it in you know where, there was a Mr. Dick made his two hands revolve very fast about each other a great number of times, and then brought them into collision and rolled them over one another to express confusion. There was a sort of thing done to me somehow, eh?" I nodded at him, and he nodded back again. "In short, boy," said Mr. Dick, dropping his voice to a whisper, "I'm simple." I would have qualified that conclusion, but he stopped me. "Yes, I am." "Yes, I am. She pretends I'm not. She won't hear of it. But I am. I know I am. If she hadn't stood my friend, sir, I should have been shut up, to lead a dismal life these many years. But I'll provide for her. I never spend the copying money. I put it in a box. I have made a will. I'll leave it all to her. She shall be rich, noble." Mr. Dick took out his pocket handkerchief and wiped his eyes. He then folded it up with great care, pressed it smooth between his two hands, put it in his pocket, and seemed to put my aunt away with it. "Now you're a scholar, Trotwood," said Mr. Dick. "You are a fine scholar. You know what a learned man, what a great man the doctor is. You know what honor he has always done me. Not proud in his wisdom, humble, condescending even to poor Dick, who is simple and knows nothing. I have sent his name up on a scrap of paper to the kite along the string, and when it has been in the sky among the larks, the kite has been glad to receive it, sir, and the sky has been brighter with it." I delighted him by saying most heartily that the doctor was deserving of our best respect and highest esteem. "And his beautiful wife is a star," said Mr. Dick, "a shining star. And I have seen her shine, sir." But bringing his chair nearer, and laying one hand upon my knee, "Clouds, sir, clouds." I answered the solicitude which his face expressed by conveying the same expression into my own, and shaking my head. "What clouds?" said Mr. Dick. He looked so wistfully into my face. Well, I want to define that word, wistful. Having or showing a feeling of vague or regretful longing. So, expressing a kind of sad desire. He looked so wistfully into my face and was so anxious to understand that I took great pains to answer him slowly and distinctly, as I might have entered on an explanation to a child. "There is some unfortunate division between them," I replied, "some unhappy cause of separation, a secret. It may be inseparable from the discrepancy in their years. It may have grown up out of almost nothing." Mr. Dick, who had told of every sentence with a thoughtful nod, paused when I had done and sat considering, with his eyes upon my face and his hand upon my knee. "Doctor not angry with her, Trotwood," he said, after some time. No, devoted to her." "Then I've got it, boy." The sudden exultation with which he slapped me on the knee and leaned back in his chair with his eyebrows lifted up as high as he possibly could lift them made me think him farther out of his wits than ever. He became suddenly grave again, and leaning forward, as before, said first, respectfully, taking out his pocket handkerchief, as if it really did represent my aunt, "Most wonderful woman in the world, Trotwood. Why, has she done nothing to set things right?" "Too delicate and difficult a subject for such interference," I replied. "Fine scholar," said Mr. Dick, touching me with his finger. "Why has he done nothing?" "For the same reason," I returned. "Then I've got it, boy," said Mr. Dick, and he stood up before me more exultingly than before, nodding his head and striking himself repeatedly upon the breast. This is the breast area here. Until one might have supposed that he had nearly nodded and struck all the breath out of his body. "A poor fellow with a craze, sir," said Mr. Dick. "A simpleton. A simpleton, that's another way of saying like a stupid person. Somebody who's not very smart. A weak-minded person. Present company, you know." Striking himself again. "May do what wonderful people may not do. I'll bring them together, boy. I'll try. They'll not blame me. They'll not object to me. They'll not mind what I do, if it's wrong. I'm only Mr. Dick. And who minds Dick? Dick's nobody." Whew! He blew a slight contemptuous breath, as if he blew himself away. So he's thinking he can repair their relationship because Mr. Dick is a little bit crazy, so he never gets blamed for doing anything. So he can do whatever he wants and get away with it. It was fortunate that he had proceeded so far by his mystery, for we heard the coach stop at the little green garden gate, which brought my aunt and Dora home. "Not a word, boy," he pursued in a whisper. "Leave all the blame with Dick. Simple Dick. Mad Dick. Mad means crazy here. I've been thinking, sir, for some time that I was getting it, and now I have got it. After what you said to me, I'm sure I've got it. All right. Not another word did Mr. Dick utter on the subject. But he made a very telegraph of himself for the next half of an hour, to the great disturbance of my aunt's mind, to enjoin inviolable secrecy on me. To my surprise, I heard no more about it for some 2 or 3 weeks, though I was sufficiently interested in the result of his endeavors. An endeavor is when you try to do something. Endeavor is kind of like a fancy word for try. Descrying a strange gleam of good sense, I say nothing of good feeling, for that he always exhibited, in conclusion to which he had come, at last, I began to believe that in the flighty and unsettled state of his mind he had either forgotten his intention, or abandoned it. One fair evening, when Dora was not inclined to go out, my aunt and I strolled up to the doctor's cottage. It was autumn, when there were no debates to vex the evening air. Vex means annoy. And I remember how the leaves smelt like our garden at Blunderstone as we trod them underfoot, and how the old unhappy feeling seemed to go by on the sighing wind. It was twilight when we reached the cottage. Mrs. Strong was just coming out of the garden, where Mr. Dick yet lingered. Lingering means staying somewhere probably when you should be going. So if you're lingering somewhere, it means you're staying around when you're supposed to already leave. Busy with his knife, helping the gardener to point some stakes. The doctor was engaged with someone in his study, but the visitor would be gone directly, Mrs. Strong said, and begged us to remain to see him. We went into the drawing-room with her and sat down by the darkening window. There was never any ceremony about the visits of such old friends and neighbors as we were. We had not sat here many minutes when Mrs. Markleham, who usually contrived to be in a fuss about something, came bustling in with her newspaper in her hand and said, out of breath, "My goodness gracious, Annie, why didn't you tell me there was somebody in the study?" "My dear mamma," she quietly returned, "how could I know that you desired the information?" "Desired the information," said Mrs. Markleham, sinking on the sofa. "I've never had such a turn in all of my life." "Have you been to the study, then?" said mamma, asked Annie. "Been to the study, my dear," she returned emphatically. "Indeed I have. I came upon the amiable creature, if you'll imagine my feelings, Miss Trotwood and David, in the act of making his will." Her daughter looked round from the window quickly. "In the act, my dear Annie," repeated Mrs. Markleham, spreading the newspaper over her lap like a tablecloth, and patting her hands upon it, and making his last will and testament. The foresight and affection of the dear. I must tell you how it was. I really must. The injustice of the darling, for he is nothing less. Tell you how it was. Perhaps you know, Miss Trotwood, that there is never a candle lighted in this house until one's eyes are literally falling on one's head, with being stretched to read the paper. And there's not a chair in this house in which a paper can be what I call read, except one in the study. This took me to the study, where I saw a light. I opened the door. In company with the dear doctor were two professional people, evidently connected with the law, and they were all three standing at the table. And the darling doctor, pen in hand, "This simply expresses, then," said the doctor, "Annie, my love, attend to the very words. This simply expresses, then, gentlemen, the confidence I have in Mrs. Strong, and gives her all unconditionally." One of the professional people replied, "And gives her all unconditionally." Upon that, with the natural feelings of a mother, I said, "Good God, I beg your pardon," fell over the doorstep, and came away through a little back passage where the pantry is. Mrs. Strong opened the window and went out into the veranda, where she stood leaning against a pillar. "But now, isn't it, Miss Trotwood? Isn't it, David? Invigorating," said Mrs. Markleham, mechanically following her with her eyes. "To find a man at Dr. Strong's time of life with the strength of mind to do this kind of thing. It only shows how right I was. I said to Annie, when Dr. Strong paid a very flattering visit to myself, and made her the subject of a declaration and an offer, I said, 'My dear, there's no doubt whatever in my opinion with reference to a suitable provision for you, that Dr. Strong will do more than he binds himself to do.'" Here the bell rang, and we heard the sound of visitors' feet as they went out. "It's all over, no doubt," said the old soldier, after listening. "The dear creature has signed, sealed, and delivered, and his mind's at rest. Well, well, it may be. What a mind! Annie, my love, I'm going to the study with my paper, for I'm a poor creature without news. Miss Trotwood, David, pray come and see the doctor." I was conscious of Mr. Dix standing in the shadow of the room, shutting up his knife, when we accompanied her to the study, and of my aunt's rubbing her nose violently by the way, as a mild vent for her intolerance of our military friend, who got first into the study, and how Mrs. Markleham settled herself in a moment in her easy-chair, or how my aunt and I came to be left together near the door. Unless her eyes were quicker than mine, and she held me back, I have forgotten if I ever knew. But this I know, that we saw the doctor before he saw us, sitting at his table among the folio volumes, in which he delighted, resting his head calmly on his hand. That in the same moment we saw Mrs. Strong glide in, pale and trembling. That Mr. Dick supported her on his arm. That he laid his other hand upon the doctor's arm, causing him to look up with an abstracted air. That, as the doctor moved his head, his wife dropped down on one knee at his feet, and with her hands imploringly lifted, fixed upon his face the memorable look I had never forgotten. That at this sight Mrs. Markleham dropped the newspaper and stared more like a figurehead intended for a ship, to be called the astonishment than anything else I can think of. The gentleness in the doctor's manner and surprise, the dignity that mingling is like mixing, that mingled with the supplicating attitude of his wife, the amiable concern of Mr. Dick, and the earnestness with which my aunt said to herself, "That man mad," triumphantly expressive of the misery from which she had saved him. I see and hear rather than remember as I write about it. "Doctor," said Mr. Dick, "what is it that's amiss? Look here. When you say something is amiss, that means something is wrong, something is not right." "Annie," cried the doctor, "not at my feet, my dear." "Yes," she said, "I beg and pray that no one will leave the room. Oh, my husband and father, break this long silence. Let us both know what it is that has come between us." Mrs. Markleham, by this time recovering the power of speech, and seeming to swell with family pride and motherly indignation, here exclaimed, "Annie, get up immediately, and don't disgrace everybody belonging to you by humbling yourself like that, unless you wish to see me go out of my mind on the spot." "Mamma," returned Annie, "waste no words on me, for my appeal is to my husband, and even you are nothing here." "Nothing!" exclaimed Mrs. Markleham. "Me? Nothing? The child has taken leave of her senses. Please get me a glass of water." I was too attentive to the doctor and his wife to give any heed to this request. To heed something is to listen. So he said I didn't listen to her. And it made no impression on anybody else. So Mrs. Markleham panted. Panting as... That's panting. Stared and fanned herself. "Annie," said the doctor tenderly, taking her in his hands, "my dear, if any unavoidable change has come in the sequence of time upon our married life, you are not to blame. The fault is mine, and only mine. There's no change. In my affection, admiration, and respect, I wish to make you happy. I truly love and honor you. Rise, Annie, pray." But she did not rise. After looking at him for a little while, she sank down closer to him, laid her arm across his knee, and dropping her head upon it, said, "If I have any friend here who can speak one word for me or for my husband in this matter, if I have any friend here who can give a voice to any suspicion that my heart has sometimes whispered to me, if I have any friend here who honors my husband or has ever cared for me, and has anything within his knowledge, no matter what it is, that may help to mediate between us, I implore that friend to speak." There was a profound silence after a few moments of painful hesitation. I broke the silence. "Mrs. Strong," I said, "there is something within my knowledge which I have been earnestly entreated by the Dr. Strong to conceal, and have concealed it until tonight. But I believe the time has come when it would be mistaken faith and delicacy to conceal it any longer, and when your appeal absolves me for his injunction." She turned her face towards me for a moment, and I knew that I was right. I could not have resisted its entreaty if the assurance that it gave me had been less convincing. "Our future peace," she said, "may be in your hands. I trust it confidently that you are not suppressing anything. I know beforehand that nothing you or anyone can tell me will show my husband's noble heart in any other light than one. Howsoever it may seem to you to touch me, disregard that. I will speak for myself before him, and before God afterwards." Thus earnestly besought, I made no reference to the doctor for his permission, but without any other compromise of the truth than a little softening of the coarseness of Uriah Heep, related plainly what had passed in the same room that night. The staring of Mrs. Markleham during the whole narration, then the shrill, sharp interjections with which she occasionally interrupted, defy description. When I had finished, Annie remained for some few moments silent, with her head bent down, as I have described. Then she took the doctor's hand. He was sitting in the same attitude as when we had entered the room, and pressed it to her breast and kissed it. Mr. Dick softly raised her, and she stood. When she began to speak, leaning on him, and looking down upon her husband, from whom she never turned her eyes, all that has ever been in my mind since I was married," she said in a low, submissive, tender voice, "I will lay bare before you. I could not live and have one reservation, knowing what I know now." "Nay, Annie," said the doctor mildly, "I have never doubted you, my child. There's no need, indeed there's no need, my dear." "There is great need," she answered in the same way, "that I should open my whole heart before the soul of generosity and truth, whom year by year and day by day I have loved and venerated more and more, as heaven knows." "Really," interrupted Mrs. Markleham, if I have any discretion at all, which you haven't, you marplot," observed my aunt with an indignant whisper. What's a marplot? Let's see. Marplot. One who frustrates or ruins something. Someone who's always interfering. That's not a modern word. You can't use that in contemporary English. "I must be permitted to observe that I cannot be requisite to enter into these details." "No one but my husband can judge of that, mamma," said Annie, without removing her eyes from his face. "And he will hear me if I say anything to give you pain, mamma. Forgive me. I have borne pain first, often and long myself." "Upon my word," gasped Mrs. Markleham. "When I was very young," said Annie, "quite a little child, my first associations with knowledge of any kind were inseparable from a patient friend and teacher, a friend of my dear, dead father, who was always dear to me. I can remember nothing that I know without remembering him. He stored my mind with its first treasures, and stamped his character upon them all. They never could have been, I think, as good as they have been to me, if I had taken them from any other hands." "Makes her mother nothing!" exclaimed Mrs. Markleham. "Not so, mamma," said Annie, "but I make him what he was. I must do that. As I grew up, he occupied the same place still. I was proud of his interest, deeply, fondly, gratefully attached to him. I looked up to him. I can hardly describe how, as a father, as a guide, as one whose praise was different from all the other praise, as one in whom I could have trusted and confided, if I had doubted all the world. You know, mamma, how young and inexperienced I was when you presented him before me, of a sudden, as a lover." "I have mentioned the fact 50 times at least to everybody here," said Mrs. Markleham. "Then hold your tongue, for Lord's sake, and don't mention it any more," muttered my aunt. "It was so great a change, so great a loss. I felt it at first," said Annie, still preserving the same look and tone, "that I was agitated and distressed. I was but a girl, when so great a change came in the character in which I had so long looked up to him. I think I was sorry, but nothing could have made him what he used to be again, and I was proud that he should think me so worthy. And we were married at St. Alphege, Canterbury," observed Mrs. Markleham. "Confound the woman," said my aunt. "She won't be quiet." "I never thought," proceeded Annie with a heightened color, "of any worldly gain that my husband would bring to me. My young heart had no room in its homage for any such poor reference. Mamma, forgive me when I say that it was you who first presented to my mind the thought that anyone could wrong me, and wrong him by such a cruel suspicion." "Me!" cried Mrs. Markleham. "Ah, you to be sure," observed my aunt, "and you can't fan it away, my military friend." "It was the first unhappiness of my new life," said Annie. "It was the first occasion of every unhappy moment I have known. These moments have been more of late than I can count, but not, my generous husband. Not for the reason you suppose, for in my heart there is not a thought, a recollection, or a hope that any power could separate from you." She raised her eyes and clasped her hands, and looked as beautiful and true, I thought, as any spirit. The doctor looked on her henceforth, and steadfastly she on him. "Mamma is blameless," she went on, "of having ever urged you for herself, and she is blameless in intention every way, I'm sure. But when I saw how many importunate claims were pressed upon you in my name, how you were traded on in my name, how generous you were, and how Mr. Wickfield, who had your welfare very much at heart, resented it, the first sense of my exposure to the mean suspicion that my tenderness was bought and sold to you, of all men on earth, fell upon me like unmerited disgrace, in which I forced you to participate. I cannot tell you what it was, Mamma cannot imagine what it was, to have this dread and trouble always on my mind, yet know in my own soul that on my marriage day I crowned the love and honor of my life." "A specimen of the thanks one gets," cried Mrs. Markleham in tears, "for taking care of one's family. I wish I was a Turk." "I wish you were with all my heart, and in your native country," said my aunt. It was at that time Mamma was most solicitous about my cousin Malden. I had liked him, she spoke softly, but without any hesitation, very much. We had been little lovers once. If circumstances had not been otherwise, I might have come to persuade myself that I really loved him, and might have married him and been most wretched. There can be no disparity in marriage like unsuitability of mind and purpose. I pondered those words, even while I was studiously attending to what followed, and if they had some particular interest or some strange application that I could not divine, here divine means guess, I could not guess. There can be no disparity in marriage like the unsuitability of mind and purpose. No disparity in marriage like the unsuitability of mind and purpose. "There is nothing," said Annie, "that we have in common. I have long found that there is nothing. If I were thankful to my husband for no more, instead for so much, I should be thankful to him for having saved me from the first mistaken impulse of my undisciplined heart." She stood quite still before the doctor and spoke with an earnestness that thrilled me, yet her voice was just as quiet as before. "When he was waiting to be the object of your munificence," what is a munificence? Munificence. Quality of being generous, great generosity. "When he was waiting to be the object of your munificence, your generosity, so freely bestowed for my sake, and when I was unhappy in the mercenary shape I was made to wear, I thought it would have become him better to have worked his own way on. I thought that if I had been he, I would have tried to do it, at the cost of almost any hardship. But I thought no worse of him until the night of his departure for India. That night I knew he had a false and thankless heart. I saw a double meaning then in Mr. Wickfield's scrutiny of me. I perceived for the first time the dark suspicion that shadowed my life. "Suspicion, Annie," said the doctor. "No, no, no." "In your mind there was none. I know my husband," she returned, "and when I came to you that night to lay down all my load of shame and grief, and knew that I had to tell you that, underneath your roof, one of my own kindred, to whom you have been a benefactor for the love of me, had spoken to me words that should have found no utterance, even if I had the weak and mercenary wretch, even if I had been the weak and mercenary wretch he thought me, my mind revolted from the taint, and the very tale conveyed. It died upon my lips, and from that hour until now has never passed them." So it seems like she had an opportunity to have an affair with Jack Maldon, but she never did it. And she hated him. From that time on, she started hating him. Mrs. Markleham, with a short groan, leaned back in her chair and retired behind her fan, as if she never were coming out any more. I have never, but in your presence, interchanged a word with him from that time then, only when it has been necessary for the avoidance of this explanation. Years have passed since he knew from me what his situation here was, the kindness you have secretly done for him for his advancement, and then disclosed to me for my surprise and pleasure, have been, you will believe, but aggravations of the unhappiness and burden of my secret. She sunk down gently at the doctor's feet, though he did his utmost to prevent her, and said, looking up tearfully into his face, "Do not speak to me yet. Let me say a little more, right or wrong. If this were to be done again, I think I should do just the same. You never can know what it is to be devoted to you, with those old associations, to find that anyone could be so hard to suppose that the truth of my heart was bartered away, and to be surrounded by appearances confirming that belief. I was very young. I had no adviser. Between Mamma and me, in all relating to you, there was a wide division, and if I shrunk into myself, hiding the disrespect I had undergone, it was because I honored you so much, and so much wished that you should honor me." "Annie, my pure heart," said the doctor, "my dear girl, a little more, a very few words more. I used to think there were so many whom you might have married, who would not have brought such a charge and trouble on you, and who would have made your home a worthier home. I used to be afraid that I had better have remained your pupil, and almost your child. I used to fear that I was so unsuited to your learning and wisdom. If all this made me shrink within myself, as indeed it did, when I had to tell it, it was still because I honored you so much, and hoped you might one day honor me. The day has shown this long time, Annie," said the doctor, "and can have but one long night, my dear. Another word, I afterwards meant, steadfastly meant, and proposed to myself to bear the whole weight of knowing the unworthiness of one to whom you had been so good. And now a last word, dearest and best friends. The cause of the late change in you, which I had seen with so much pain and sorrow, and have sometimes referred to my old apprehension, at other times to lingering suppositions nearer to the truth, has been made clear tonight. By an accident I have also come to know tonight the full measure of your noble trust in me, and even under that mistake, I do not hope that any love and duty I may render in return will ever make me worthy of your priceless confidence. But with all this knowledge fresh upon me, I can lift my eyes to this dear face, revered as a father's loved, as a husband's, sacred to me in my childhood as a friend's, and solemnly declare that in my lightest thought I have never wronged you, never wavered in the love and the fidelity that I owe you. She had her arms around the doctor's neck, and he leant his head down over her, mingling his gray hair with her dark brown tresses. Oh, hold me to your heart, my husband, never cast me out. Do not think or speak of disparity between us, for there is none, except in all of my many imperfections. Every succeeding year I have known this better, as I have esteemed you more and more. Oh, take me in your heart, my husband, for my love was founded on a rock, and it endures. In the silence that ensued, my aunt walked gravely up to Mr. Dick, without at all hurrying herself, and gave him a hug and a sounding kiss. And it was very fortunate, with a view to his credit, that she did so, for I am confident that I detected him at that moment in the act of making preparations to stand on one leg as an appropriate expression of delight. "You're a very remarkable man, Dick," said my aunt with an air of unqualified approbation, "and never pretend to be anything else, for I know better." With that, my aunt pulled him by the sleeve and nodded to me, and we three stole quietly out of the room and came away. "That's a settler for our military friend, at any rate," said my aunt on the way home. I should sleep the better for that, if there was nothing else to be glad of." "She was quite overcome, I'm afraid," said Mr. Dick, with great commiseration. "What? Did you ever see a crocodile overcome?" inquired my aunt. "To be overcome means to be overwhelmed, shocked, something like that. Defeated." "There never would have been anything the matter if it hadn't been for that old animal," said my aunt with a strong emphasis. "It's very much to be wished that some mothers would leave their daughters alone after marriage and not be so violently affectionate. They seem to think the only return that can be made them bringing an unfortunate young woman into the world. God bless my soul, if she asked me to be brought or wanted to come, is full liberty to worry her out of it again. What are you thinking of, Trot?" I was thinking of all that had been said. My mind was still running on some expressions used. There can be no disparity in marriage like unsuitability of mind and purpose, the first mistaken impulse of an undisciplined heart. My love was founded on a rock, but we were at home, and the trodden leaves were lying underfoot, and the autumn was blowing. Okay, well, that was the end of chapter 45. That was a pretty short chapter. I think I'll probably read chapter 46 also, but first I'm going to take a 1-minute break. I will be right back. Okay, let's get started with Chapter 46, Intelligence. And by the way, the word intelligence could mean learning new information. It doesn't always mean smart. So I have a suspicion that this chapter will be about learning some new information about an old topic. And not about being smart. But let's see. I must have been married, if I may trust to my imperfect memory for dates, about a year or so, when one evening, as I was returning from a solitary walk, thinking of the book I was then writing, for my success had steadily increased with my steady application, and I was engaged at that time upon my first work of fiction. I came past Mrs. Steerforth's house. I had often passed it before during my residence in the neighborhood, though never when I could choose another road. Howbeit, it did sometimes happen that it was not easy to find another without making a long circuit, and so I had passed the way, upon the whole, pretty often. I had never done more than glance at the house as I went by with a quickened step. It had been uniformly gloomy and dull. None of the best rooms abutted on the road, and the narrow, heavily framed old-fashioned windows, never cheerful under any circumstances, looked very dismal, close shut, with their blinds always drawn down. There was a covered way across the little paved court to an entrance that was never used, and there was one round staircase window at odds with all the rest, and the only one unshaded by a blind, which had the same unoccupied blank look. I do not remember that I ever saw a light in all the house. If I had been a casual passer-by, I should have probably supposed that some childless person lay dead in it. If I had happily possessed no knowledge of the place, and had seen it often in that changeless state, I should have pleased my fancy with many ingenious speculations, I dare say. As it was, I thought as little of it as I might, but my mind could not go away by it and leave it as my body did. And it usually awakened a long train of meditations coming before me, and on this particular evening I mention mingled with the childish recollections and later fancies. So remember, mingling is like mixing. The ghosts of the half-formed hopes, the broken shadows of disappointments dimly seen and understood, and blended of experience and imagination, incidental to the occupation with which my thoughts had been busy. It was more than commonly suggestive. I fell into a brown study as I walked on, and a voice at my side made me start. So that's what, you start when you're surprised. That's starting. So somebody surprised him, shocked him. It was a woman's voice, too. I was not long in recollecting Mrs. Steerforth's little parlour-maid, who had formerly worn blue ribbons in her cap. She had taken them out now, to adapt herself, I suppose, to the altered character of the house, and wore but one or two disconsolate bows of sober brown. "If you please, sir, would you have the goodness to walk in and speak to Mrs. Dartle?" "Has Miss Dartle sent you for me?" I inquired. "Not tonight, sir. But it's just the same. Miss Dartle saw you pass a night or two ago, and I was to sit on the staircase, and when I saw you pass again, to ask you to step in and speak to her." I turned back and inquired of my conductor, as we went along, how Mrs. Steerforth was, and she said her lady was but poorly, and kept her own room a good deal. So that means that Mrs. Steerforth would just stay in her room all day. When we arrived at the house, I was directed to Miss Dartle in the garden and left to make my presence known to her myself. She was sitting on a seat at one end of a kind of terrace overlooking the great city. It was a somber evening with a lurid light in the sky. Lurid. Let's define that word. Lurid. Vivid in color, especially so as to create an unpleasantly harsh or unnatural effect. And as I saw the prospect scowling in the distance, with here and there some larger object starting up into the sullen glare, I fancied it was no inapt companion to the memory of this fierce woman. She saw me as I advanced and rose for a moment to receive me. I thought her then still more colorless and thin than when I had seen her last, and the flashing eyes still brighter, and the scar still plainer. Our meeting was not cordial. That means it wasn't friendly or polite. We had parted angrily on the last occasion, and there was an air of disdain about her. Disdain is like hate, which she took no pains to conceal, and she didn't try to hide her hate. "I'm told you wish to speak to me, Miss Dartle," said I, standing near her with my hand upon the back of the seat and declining her gesture of invitation to sit down. "If you please," she said. "Pray, has this girl been found?" "No." "And yet she has run away." I saw her thin lips working while she looked at me, as if they were eager to load her with reproaches. "Run away?" I repeated. "Yes, from him," she said with a laugh. "If she is not found, perhaps she never will be found. She may be dead." The vaunting cruelty with which she met my glance I never saw expressed in any other face that I've ever seen. Let's see, what is vaunting? Boastful. "To wish her dead," said I, "may be the kindest wish that one of her own sex could bestow upon her. I'm glad that time has softened you so much, Miss Dartle." She condescended to make no reply, but turning on me with another scornful laugh, said, "The friends of this excellent and much injured young lady are friends of yours. You are their champion, and assert their rights. Do you wish to know what is known of her?" "Yes," said I. She rose with an ill-favored smile. So that means, when you put that word ill in front of something, it usually means something very bad. So she had like an evil smile. And taking a few steps towards the wall of the holly, was near at hand, dividing the lawn from the kitchen garden, said in a louder voice, "Come here," as if she were calling to some unclean beast. "You will restrain any demonstrative championship or vengeance in this place, of course, Mr. Copperfield?" said she, looking over her shoulder at me with the same expression. I inclined my head without knowing what she meant, and she said, "Come here," again, and returned, followed by the respectable Mr. Littimer, who, with undiminished respectability, made me a bow and took up his position behind her. The air of wicked grace, of triumph, in which, strange to say, there was yet something feminine and alluring, with which she reclined upon the seat between us and looked at me, was worthy of a cruel princess in a legend. So now he's comparing her to like an evil queen in a fairy tale or something, the way she's acting. But he's a little bit turned on by it. "Now," she said imperiously, without glancing at him, and touching the old wound as it throbbed, perhaps in this instance with pleasure rather than in pain, "tell Mr. Copperfield about the flight. Mr. James and myself, ma'am." "Don't address yourself to me," she interrupted with a frown. "Mr. James and myself, sir." "Nor to me, if you please," said I. Mr. Littimer, without being at all discomposed, signified by a slight obeisance that anything was most agreeable to us was most agreeable to him, and began. "Mr. James and myself have been abroad with the young woman ever since she left Yarmouth under Mr. James's protection. We've been in a variety of places and seen a deal of foreign country. We've been in France, Switzerland, Italy, in fact, almost all parts." He looked at the back of the seat as if he were addressing himself to that, and softly played upon it with his hands, as if he were striking chords upon a dumb piano. Mr. James took quite uncommonly to the young woman, and was more settled for a length of time than I have known him to be since I have been in his service. The young woman was very improvable, and spoke the languages, and wouldn't have known for the same country person. I noticed that she was much admired wherever she went. Miss Dartle put her hand upon her side. I saw him steal a glance at her, and slightly smile to himself. Very much admired indeed, the young woman was. What with her dress, and with that air and sun, and with being made so much of, what with this and that and the other, her merits really attracted general notice. He made a short pause. Her eyes wandered restlessly over the distant prospect, and she bit her nether lip to stop that busy mouth. Taking his hands from the seat and placing them within the other, he settled himself on one leg. Mr. Littimer proceeded, with his eyes cast down in his respectable head, a little advanced, and a little on one side. The young woman went on in this manner for some time, being occasionally low in her spirits, until I think she began to weary Mr. James by giving way to her low spirits and tempers of that kind, and things were not so comfortable. So she started getting depressed, and then I think James got bored with her. Mr. James began to be restless again, and the more restless he got, the more she got, and I must say for myself that I had a very difficult time of it indeed between the two. Still, matters were patched up here and made good there, over and over again, and altogether lasted, I'm sure, for a longer time than anybody could have expected. Recalling her eyes from the distance, she looked at me again now with her former air. Mr. Littimer, clearing his throat, that's clearing your throat, behind his hand with a respectable short cough, changed legs and went on. At last, when there had been upon the whole a good many words and reproaches, Mr. James had set off one morning from the neighborhood of Naples, where he had a villa, the young woman being very partial to the sea, and under the pretense of coming back in a day or so, left it in charge with me to break it out, that for the general happiness of all concerned he was, here an interruption of a short cough, gone. But Mr. James, I must say, certainly did behave extremely honorable, for he proposed that the young woman should marry a very respectable person, who was fully prepared to overlook the past, and who was at least as good as anybody the young woman could have aspired to in a regular way, her connections being very common. He changed legs again and then wetted his lips. This is wetting your lips. I was convinced that the scoundrel spoke of himself, and I saw my conviction reflected in Miss Dartle's face. This I also had it in charge to communicate. I was willing to do anything to relieve Mr. James from his difficulty, and to restore harmony between himself and affectionate parent, who has undergone so much on his account. Therefore I undertook the commission. The young woman's violence, when she came to after I broke the fact of his departure, was beyond all expectations. She was quite mad, and had to be held by force, or if she couldn't have got a knife or go to the sea, she'd have beaten her head against the marble floor. Miss Dartle, leaning back upon the seat with a light of exultation in her face, seemed almost to caress the sounds this fellow had uttered. But when I came to the second part of what had been entrusted to me, said Mr. Littimer, rubbing his hands uneasily, which anybody might have supposed would have been, at all events, appreciated as a kind intention. Then the young woman came out in her true colors. A more outrageous person I never did see. Her conduct was surprisingly bad. She had no more gratitude, no more feeling, no more patience, no more reason in her than a stock or a stone. If I hadn't been upon my guard, I am convinced she would have had my blood. I think the better of her for it, said I indignantly. Mr. Littimer bent his head as much to say, "Indeed, sir, but you're young," and resumed his narrative. It was necessary, in short, for a time, to take away everything nigh her, as she could do herself or anybody else an injury with, and to shut her up close. Notwithstanding which, she got out in the night, forced the lattice of the window that I had nailed up myself, dropped on a vine, and that was trailed below, and never was seen or heard of, to my knowledge, since. "She's dead, perhaps," said Miss Dartle, with a smile, as if she could have spurned the body of the ruined girl. "She may have drowned herself, miss," returned Mr. Littimer, catching at an excuse for addressing himself to somebody. "It's very possible. Or she may have had assistance from the boatmen, and the boatmen's wives and children being given to low company. She was very much in the habit of talking to them on the beach, Miss Dartle, and sitting by the boats. I have known her to do it when Mr. James had been away whole days. Mr. James was far from pleased to find out once that she had told the children she was a boatman's daughter, and that her own country long ago she had roamed about the beach like them. Oh, Emily, unhappy beauty, what a picture rose before me of her sitting on the far-off shore among the children like herself, when she was innocent, listening to little voices such as might have called her mother had she been a poor man's wife, and to the great voice of the sea and its eternal nevermore. When it was clear that nothing could be done, Miss Dartle, "Did I tell you not to speak to me?" she said, with a stern contempt. "You spoke to me, miss," he replied. "I beg your pardon, but it is my service to obey." "Do your service," she returned. "Finish your story and go." When it was clear, he said, with infinite respectability and obedient bow, that she was not to be found, I went to Mr. James at the place where I had been agreed that I should write to him, and informed him of what had occurred. Words passed between us in consequence, and I felt it due to my character to leave him. I could bear, and I have borne, a great deal from Mr. James, but he insulted me too far. He hurt me, knowing the unfortunate difference between himself and his mother, and what her anxiety of mind was likely to be. I took the liberty of coming home to England and relating. "For money, which I paid him," said Miss Dartle to me. "Just so, ma'am. In relating what I knew, I am not aware," said Mr. Littimer, after a moment's reflection, "that there is anything else. I am at present out of employment, and should be happy to meet with a respectable situation." Miss Dartle glanced at me, as though she would inquire if there were anything that I desired to ask, and there was something which had occurred to my mind. I said in reply, I wish to know from this creature, I could not bring myself to utter any more conciliatory word. Conciliatory means polite. Whether they intercepted a letter that was written to her from home, or whether he supposes that she received it. He remained calm and silent, with his eyes fixed on the ground, and the tip of every finger of his right hand delicately poised against the tip of every finger on his left. Miss Dartle turned her head disdainfully towards him. I beg your pardon, miss, he said, awakening from his abstraction. But however submissive to you, I have my position. Though a servant, Mr. Copperfield and you, miss, are different people. If Mr. Copperfield wishes to know anything from me, I take the liberty of reminding Mr. Copperfield that he can put a question to me. I have a character to maintain. After a momentary struggle with myself, I turned my eyes upon him and said, You have heard my question. Consider it addressed to yourself, if you choose. What answer do you make? Sir, he rejoined, with an occasional separation and a union of those delicate lips, my answer must be qualified, because to betray Mr. James's confidence to his mother and to betray it to you are two different actions. It is not probable, I consider, that Mr. James would encourage the receipt of letters likely to increase low spirits and unpleasantness. But further than that, sir, I should wish to avoid going. Is that all? Inquired Miss Dartle of me. I indicated I had nothing more to say, except, I added, as I saw him moving off, that I understand his fellow's part in the wicked story, and that as I shall make it known to the honest man, who has been her father from her childhood, I would recommend him to avoid going too much into public. He stopped the moment I began, and had listened with his usual repose of manner. Thank you, sir, but you'll excuse me if I say, sir, that there are neither slaves nor slave drivers in this country, and that people are not allowed to take the law into their own hands. If they do, it is more to their own peril, I believe, than to other people's. Consequently speaking, I am not at all afraid of going where I may wish, sir. With that he made a polite bow, and with another to Miss Dartle, went away through the arch in the wall of the hollow by which he had come. Miss Dartle and I regarded each other for a little while in silence, her manner being exactly what it was when she produced the man. He says, besides, she observed, with a slow curling of her lip, that his master, as he hears, is coasting Spain, and this done, is a way to gratify his seafaring taste till he is weary. But this is of no interest to you. Besides, these two proud persons, mother and son, there's a wider breach than before, and little hope of its healing. For they are one at heart, and at times make each other obstinate and imperious. Neither of this is of any interest to you, but it introduces what I wish to say. This devil whom you make an angel of, I mean this low girl, whom he picked out of the tide mud, with her black eyes full upon me, and her passionate finger up, may be alive, for I believe some common things are hard to die. If she is, you will desire to have a pearl of such price found and taken care of. We desire that too, that he may not by any chance be made her prey again. So far, we are united in one interest, and that is why I, who would do her any mischief that so coarse a wretch is capable of feeling, have sent for you to hear what you have heard. I saw by the change in her face that someone was advancing behind me. It was Mrs. Steerforth, who gave me her hand coldly, then of yore. That's another way of saying before, like long ago. And with an augmentation of her former stateliness of manner, but still, I perceived, and I was touched by it, with an ineffaceable remembrance of my old love for her son. She was greatly altered. Her fine figure was far less upright. Her handsome face was deeply marked, and her hair was almost white. But when she sat down on the seat, she was a handsome lady still. And well I know the right eye with its lofty look had been a light in my very dreams at school. Is Mr. Copperfield informed of everything, Rosa? Yes. And has he heard Littimer himself? Yes. I have told him why you wished it. You are a good girl. I had some slight correspondence with your former friend, sir, addressing me. But it has not restored his sense of duty or natural obligation. Therefore, I have no other object in this than what Rosa has mentioned, if, by the course of which you may relieve the mind of the decent man you brought here, for whom I am sorry, I can say no more, my son may be saved from again falling into the snares of a designing enemy. Well. She drew herself up and sat looking straight forward before her, far away. Madam, I said respectfully, I understand. I assure you I am in no danger of putting any strained construction on your motives. But I must say, even to you, having known this injured family from childhood, that if you suppose the girl so deeply wronged has not been cruelly deluded, and would not rather die 100 deaths than take a cup of water from your son's hand now, you cherish a terrible mistake. Well, Rosa, well, said Mrs. Steerforth, as another was about to interpose. It is no matter, let it be. You are married, sir, I am told. I answered that I had been some time married, and are doing well. I hear little in the quiet life I lead, but I understand you are beginning to be famous. I have been very fortunate, I said, and find my name connected with some praise. You have no mother? In a softened voice. No, it is a pity, she returned. She would have been proud of you. Good night. I took the hand she held out with a dignified, unbending air, and it was as calm in mine as if her breast had been at peace. Her pride could still its very pulses, it appeared, and draw the placid veil before her face, through which she sat looking straight before her on the far distance. As I moved away from them along the terrace, I could not help observing how steadily they both sat gazing on the prospect, and how it thickened and closed around them. Here and there some early lamps were seen to twinkle in the distant city, and in the eastern quarter of the sky the lurid light still hovered. But from the greater part of the broad valley interposed, a mist was rising like a sea, which, mingling in the darkness, made it seem as if the gathering waters would encompass them. I have reason to remember this, and think of it with awe. For before I looked upon those two again, a stormy sea had risen to their feet. Reflecting on what had thus been told me, I felt it right that it should be communicated to Mr. Peggotty. On the following evening I went into London in quest of him. He was always wandering about from place to place, with his one object of recovering his niece before him. He was more in London than elsewhere. Often and often now had I seen him in the dead of night passing along the streets, searching among the few who loitered out of doors at those untimely hours for what he dreaded to find. He kept a lodging over a little chandler's shop in Hungerford Market, which I had occasion to mention more than once, and from which he first went forth upon his errand of mercy. Hither I directed my walk. On making inquiry for him, I learned from the people of the house that he had not gone out yet, and I should find him in the room upstairs. He was sitting reading by a window, in which he kept a few plants. The room was very neat and orderly. I saw in a moment that he was always kept prepared for her reception, and that he never went out, but he thought it possible he might bring her home. He had not heard my tap at the door, and only raised his eyes when I laid my hand upon his shoulder. "Master Davy, thank ye, sir, thank ye hearty for this visit. Sit ye down. You're kindly welcome, sir." "Mr. Peggotty," said I, taking a chair he handed me, "don't expect much. I've heard some news." "Of Emily?" He put his hand in a nervous manner on his mouth and turned pale as he fixed his eyes on mine. "It gives no clue to where she is, but she is not with him." He sat down, looking intently at me, and listened in profound silence to all I had to tell. I well remember the sense of dignity, beauty even, with which the patient gravity of his face impressed me. When, having gradually removed his eyes from mine, he sat looking downward, leaning his forehead on his hand. He offered no interruption, but remained throughout perfectly still. He seemed to pursue her figure through the narrative, and to let every other shape go by him, as if it were nothing. When I had done, he shaded his face and continued silent. I looked out the window for a little while and occupied myself with the plants. "How do you fare to feel about it, Master Davy?" he inquired at length. "I think that she's living," I replied. "I don't know. Maybe the first shock was too rough, and in the wilderness of her art, that there blue water as she used to speak on, could she have thought that so many year because it was to be her grave." So he's thinking, I don't know, maybe she jumped in the sea. He said this musing in a low, frightened voice and walked across the little room. "And yet," he added, "Master Davy, I have felt so sure, as she was living, as I have knowed awake and sleeping, as it was so true, that I should find her, that I have been so led on by it, and held up by it, that I don't believe I can have been deceived. No, Emily is alive." He put his hand down firmly on the table and set his sunburnt face into a resolute expression. "My niece Emily's alive, sir," he said steadfastly. "I don't know where it comes from or how 'tis, but I'm told she's alive." He looked almost like a man inspired as he said it. I waited for a few moments until he could give me his undivided attention, and then proceeded to explain the precaution that it had occurred to me last night it would be wise to take. "Now, my dear friend," I began. Thank ye, kind sir," he said, grasping my hand in both of his. "If she should make her way to London, which is likely, for where she could lose herself so readily as in this vast city, and what would she wish to do but lose and hide herself if she does not go home?" "And she won't go home," he interposed, shaking his head mournfully. "If she had left her own accord, she might not as it was, sir." "If she should come here," said I believe there is one person here more likely to discover her than any in the world. Do you remember? Hear what I say with fortitude. Think of your great object. Do you remember Martha?" "Of our town." I needed no other answer than his face. "Did you know that she's in London?" "I've seen her in the streets," he answered with a shiver. "But you don't know," said I, "that Emily was charitable to her with Ham's help long before she fled from home, nor that When we met one night and spoke together in the room yonder, yonder means over there, over the way, she listened at the door. Master Davy, he replied in astonishment, that night when it snew so hard? That night. I have never seen her since. I went back after parting from you to speak to her, but she was gone. I was unwilling to mention her to you then, and I am now, but she's the person of whom I speak, and with whom I think we should communicate. Do you understand? Too well, sir, he replied. We had sunk our voices almost to a whisper, and continued to speak in that tone. You say you've seen her. Do you think you could find her? I could only hope to do so by chance. I think, Master Davy, I know where to look. It is dark, being together. Shall we go out now and try to find her tonight? He assented, and prepared to accompany me without appearing to observe what he was doing. I saw how carefully he adjusted the little room, put a candle ready, and the means of lighting it, arranged the bed, and finally took out of a drawer one of her dresses. I remembered to have seen her wear it, neatly folded with some other garments, and a bonnet which he placed upon the chair. He made no allusion to these clothes, neither did I. That means he didn't talk about it. He just did it and didn't say what it was, and he made no comments about it. There they had been waiting for her many, many night, no doubt. The time was, Master Davy, he said, as we come downstairs, when I thought this girl Martha almost like the dirt underneath Emily's feet. God forgive me, there's a difference now. As we went along, partly to hold him in conversation and partly to satisfy myself, I asked him about Ham. He said, almost in the same words as formerly, that Ham was just the same, wearing away his life, with kinder no care no how for it, but never murmuring, and liked by all. I asked him what he thought of Ham's state of mind was, in reference to the cause of their misfortunes, whether he believed it was dangerous, what he supposed, for example, Ham would do if he and Steerforth ever should encounter. I don't know, sir, he replied. I have thought of it oftentimes, but I can't awise myself to it no matters. I recalled to his remembrance the morning after her departure when we were all three on the beach. Do you recollect, said I, a certain wild way in which he looked out to the sea and spoke about the end of it? Sure I do, said he. What do you suppose he meant? Master Davy, he replied. I put the question to myself a mort times and never found no answer. And there's one curious thing that, though he's so pleasant, I wouldn't fear to feel comfortable to try and get his mind upon it. He never would say a word to me, as warrant, as dutiful could be, and it ain't likely that he begin to speak any other ways now, but it's fur from being fleet water in his mind where them thoughts lays. It's deep, sir, and I can't see down. You're right, said I, and that has sometimes made me anxious. And me too, Master Davy, he rejoined. Even more so, I do assure you that his venturesome ways, though both belongs to the alteration in him, I don't know as he'd do violence under any circumstances, but I hope as them two may be kept asunders. So he's saying, well, I don't think that Ham would attack him, but I hope that they never meet. We don't want to test that theory. We had come through Temple Bar into the city, conversing no more now and walking at my side. He yielded himself to the one aim of his devoted life, and went on. With that hushed concentration of his faculties, which would have made his figure solitary in a multitude, we were not far from Blackfriars Bridge when he turned his head and pointed to a solitary female figure flitting along the opposite side of the street. I knew it readily to be the figure that we sought. We crossed the road and were pressing on towards her when it occurred to me that she might be more disposed to feel a woman's interest in the lost girl if we spoke to her in a quieter place, aloof from the crowd, where we should be less observed. I advised my companion, therefore, that we should not address her yet, but follow her, consulting in this likewise an indistinct desire I had to know where she went. He acquiescing, we followed at a distance, never losing sight of her, but never caring to come very near, as she frequently looked about. Once she stopped to listen to a band of music, and then we stopped too. She went on a long way, still went on, and it was evident from the manner in which she held her course that she was going to some fixed destination. And this, and her keeping in the busy streets, and I suppose the strange fascination in the secrecy and mystery of so following anyone, made me adhere to my first purpose. At length, she turned into a dull, dark street where the noise and crowd were lost, and I said, "May we speak to her now?" And mending our pace, we went after her. Okay, well, that was the end of chapter 46. So chapter 47, I think tomorrow night at around the same time, we will read chapter 47, Martha. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope that you come back and you join me at the same time tomorrow when we continue with chapter 47. Goodbye.